Welcome to the debate.
Good to be here.
Today, we are opening the hood on a machine that really drives the global corporate economy. And I have to say, it is a very expensive machine. We're talking about the industry of leadership development.
Expensive is an understatement.
It really is. I mean, depending on whose numbers you trust, organizations globally are spending somewhere north of $350 billion every single year on training, retreats, executive coaching, you name it. It's a staggering amount of capital. And yet, the source material we're looking at today suggests there is a massive problem with the return on that investment.
Right. I mean, if you spent that kind of money on R&D or manufacturing and got the results we see in leadership training, you'd fire the entire department.
Exactly. The literature points to this persistent, almost frustrating paradox. We have smart people, we have expensive training, and yet there's this gaping chasm between knowing what a good leader should do and actually doing it in the real world. So the central question we're debating today is, why?
And specifically, where do we point the finger? Do we point it at the person we're training? Or do we point it at the system that person has to operate in?
That is the core tension. And I'm taking the position that leadership is fundamentally a human endeavor. It's about the individual. It's about psychology, personal capacity, and what the texts call self-efficacy. If you want better leadership, you have to build better people. It's the old great person theory. You need a hero, or at least someone capable of heroic acts.
And I'm taking the position that the great person approach is exactly why we're flushing billions of dollars down the drain. I believe the material clearly shows that leadership is a collective process. It relies on systems, on culture, on context. If you take a brilliant individual and drop them into a broken system, the system wins every time. You can't fix the organization by just polishing the cogs.
Polishing the cogs? I think that's a bit reductive, but let's get into the argument.
Let's do it.
I want to ground us in the definition of the work itself. When we look at the academic literature, the foundational texts on this subject, how is leadership development actually defined? It isn't defined as organizational consulting. It's defined explicitly as the process which helps expand the capacity of individuals to perform in leadership roles.
That is the traditional definition, yes.
Well, it's the definition because it's the mechanism of action. Think about it. You can't train a department to have empathy. You can't train a policy to have a vision. You can only train a human being. And the material points to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst as one of the ultimate examples of this.
Sandhurst is legendary, sure, but it's also a military academy. It's a bit of an extreme example, isn't it?
But the principles apply everywhere. Sandhurst doesn't operate on the assumption that this system will make you a leader. No, they operate on a model of intense selection and individual potential. They argue that you have to identify specific psychological traits before you even begin the training. They're looking for things like high achievement drive, openness to experience, and specifically an internal locus of control.
Let's pause on internal locus of control for a second. Just for the listeners, we should probably unpack that.
Sure, it's a psychological term. If you have an internal locus of control, you believe that events in your life are caused by your own actions. You're the driver. If you have an external locus of control, you believe life happens to you. Luck, fate, the boss's mood. The argument here is that you can't lead if you don't believe you have agency. Development, in my view, is the process of strengthening that internal psychology. It's about building what Albert Bandura calls self-efficacy.
Bandura is a heavy hitter in psychology.
He is. And his concept of self-efficacy is absolutely crucial here. It's the rock-solid belief in one's own capabilities to organize and execute a course of action. That belief happens inside a brain. It doesn't happen in the hallways. It doesn't happen in the employee handbook. It is a deeply personal, psychological revolution. If you don't have that individual spark, no amount of systemic support is going to make you a leader.
Okay, I don't disagree that confidence is better than insecurity, but I think you're painting a very romantic picture of the hero leader. You're describing a model where we pluck some special person, fill them with Sandhurst-style grit, and drop them into a company to save the day. But here's the cold water, and it comes straight from the data. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a study in 2015 that analyzed traditional classroom-style training, which is, exactly what you're advocating for.
I have a feeling I'm not going to like this number.
You really aren't. They estimated that as little as 15% of the learning from that training results in sustained behavioral change. 15. Just think about that ROI. If an auto manufacturer built cars where only 15% of them started when you turned the key, they would be out of business in a week. Yet, in leadership development, we just accept this failure rate. This is what the management expert Henry Mintzberg calls the knowing-doing gap. We fill these individuals with theories, we give them self-efficacy, and then they go back to their desks and nothing happens.
Okay, but we have to ask why nothing happens. Is that a failure of the focus on the individual, or is that just bad teaching? Maybe the seminar was boring.
It's the destination. The material cites Baldwin and Ford from 1988, and this isn't new information, by the way, and their findings are just damning for your position. They prove that the transfer of training depends heavily, perhaps primarily, on the support for behavioral change from the leader's supervisor.
The supervisor.
Right, the environment. You take a manager, let's call him Bob, you send Bob to a retreat. He gets his expanded capacity. He comes back fired up, ready to lead with empathy and vision. But his boss says, "That's cute, Bob, but we have a deadline. Stop talking and get back to work." Bob's individual capacity is instantly erased by the systemic context. The swamp of the organization just swallows him up.
I understand the swamp argument. I really do. But if we follow that logic to its conclusion, we stop training Bob entirely. We just complain about the swamp. The literature makes a clear distinction between leader development, what I'm talking about, developing human capital, and leadership development, which is what you're talking about, developing connections. I argue that if you stop focusing on the individual because the system is hard, you are surrendering agency. You are saying the machine is more powerful than the human. I just don't accept that. A true leader, properly developed, looks at the swamp and decides to drain it.
That sounds great on a motivational poster, but in reality, Bob just quits. Or worse, he conforms.
Let's look at the mechanism of learning itself, because I think this proves my point about the individual being central. The material references David Kolb deeply. He's the titan of experiential learning. His model is, the gold standard for how adults grow.
Kolb is valid. I'm not disputing Kolb.
Well, let's look at his model. It is entirely individual-centric. He outlines 4 stages of learning. Stage 1, concrete experience. You do something. Stage 2, observation and reflection. You think about what happened. Stage 3, forming abstract concepts. You build a mental theory. And Stage 4, testing in new situations. Look at Stage 2 and 3, reflection and conceptualization. Those are solitary cognitive acts. The system cannot reflect for you. The team cannot form a concept in your brain. If you don't focus on the individual's cognitive process, learning literally cannot occur. It's a biological fact.
I'm not saying the individual doesn't need a functioning brain. I'm saying your application of Kolb is incomplete because you are ignoring the 4th stage, testing in new situations. You can't test a leadership behavior in a vacuum. You can't practice leading in front of a mirror. You have to do it with other people.
Which then provides data back to the individual for reflection.
But the quality of that testing phase depends entirely on the collective. The material explicitly states that effective development is more likely when it integrates a range of experiences over a set period, specifically 6 to 12 months. Why does it take a year? It's not because the individual is slow. It's because effective testing requires feedback loops. It requires 360-degree feedback from peers. It requires executive coaching. It requires mentoring. These are all relational dynamics. If I try to test my new leadership style, say being more open to ideas, and my team reacts with hostility because the culture is toxic, I'm going to learn the wrong lesson. I'll learn to keep my mouth shut. Kolb's cycle breaks if the environment doesn't support the experiment.
I think you're confusing the gym with the athlete. Yes, you need a gym, the environment to train, but you're still training the athlete, the person. The muscle growth happens in the body, not in the weights. But let's pivot to how organizations actually plan for the future, because I think this is where the systemic argument really struggles to explain reality. I'm talking about succession planning.
Ah,
The crown prince phenomenon?
Call it what you want, but it's the process of ensuring the organization survives. Succession planning is, by definition, the identification of high potentials, the elite few. The material notes that in multinational corporations, this involves very specific, curated experiences, international transfers, cross-departmental rotations. We send a specific human being, let's call her Jane, from London to Singapore for 2 years. Why do we do that? We're curating the life experience of a specific vessel, the leader. We aren't trying to fix the Singapore system. We are trying to give Jane the perspective she needs to lead. If leadership was purely collective, we wouldn't need to move Jane. We just optimize the team she manages.
That is the traditional view, and it leads to a lot of burned-out Janes. I want to introduce a different concept from the text that challenges that entire high-potential hierarchy. It's called employeeship.
Employeeship. I have to be honest, it sounds a bit submissive, like we're training people to be better worker bees.
It only sounds like that if you're obsessed with the great man hierarchy. Employeeship has been particularly successful in Scandinavia, specifically in Sweden. Now, we know that Scandinavian business cultures often have a low power distance. That means the gap between the boss and the worker is very small. They don't put the leader on a pedestal, and the material notes that in this model, the traits of a good leader are recognized as being not too dissimilar to what it takes to be a good employee.
So everyone is a leader? That sounds like chaos. If everyone is in charge, no one is.
It's not that everyone is in charge. It's that the responsibility for the success of the organization is shared. Instead of taking the high-potential Jane and putting her in a special tower with special training, which, by the way, alienates her from the team, the employeeship model suggests you bring the leader and the team together to explore their similarities. You develop them as a unit. When you focus entirely on the individual, on the elite, you create a culture of competition. You create disconnection. But if you focus on the interpersonal linkages, you build a resilient web. The Swedish model suggests the leader is just an employee with a different set of responsibilities, not a different species of human.
I can see the egalitarian appeal. It feels very modern. But let's be practical. Organizations need direction. They need strategy. And that brings me to the concept of visioning. The material identifies this as a non-negotiable component of leadership development, the ability to formulate a clear image of the aspired future.
Sure, you need a plan.
It's more than a plan. It's a dream. Succession planning relies on what we aspire to become, not just where we've been. Who generates that aspiration? A committee doesn't dream. A system doesn't hallucinate a new future. A person does. The text emphasizes that you need someone with the cognitive capacity to project into the future. That active imagination is an individual attribute. You need a person with high openness to experience and high achievement drive to stand up and say, "Follow me, we are going there." If you rely on the collective, you just get the status quo. The collective protects the norm. If you want a breakthrough, you need an individual visionary.
That's a very seductive narrative. We all love the story of the visionary genius. But let me ask you, what happens to a vision if no one understands it? The definition of leadership roles in our text is very specific about this. It says roles are those that facilitate execution of an organization's strategy through building alignment and winning mindshare.
Winning mindshare, exactly. The leader wins it.
But winning mindshare implies a relationship. It implies there are minds to be won. You can have the most brilliant visionary in the world, a real Steve Jobs type. But if you drop him into a rigid, bureaucratic, fossilized system that stifles communication, what happens? He screams into the void. Baldwin and Ford would warn us here. The capacity of the individual is irrelevant if the interpersonal linkages are broken. If the system doesn't have the channels for that vision to travel, the vision dies inside the leader's head. So I argue, don't spend the $1 million teaching the leader how to dream better. Spend the $1 million fixing the communication channels so the dream can actually be heard.
I struggle with that because it assumes the system is static. It assumes the swamp stays a swamp forever unless a system mechanic comes in to fix it. But a truly developed leader, one with high self-efficacy, one who understands their role perception, changes the linkages. They bust the bureaucracy. They fire the people who block communication. That is why we pay them the big bucks. If we wait for the system to fix itself, we'll be waiting forever. We need the catalyst. The individual is the catalyst.
Or more likely, they burn out and become part of that 85% failure statistic. The research shows that when you drop a change agent into a system that isn't ready, the system has an immune response. It attacks the agent. This is why retention rates for these high potentials are often so worrying. We set them up for failure by telling them they're Superman, and then we hand them kryptonite.
We're running close to our time, and I feel like we're standing on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon here. So let me try to summarize the case for the individual one last time. I acknowledge that context matters. I'm not saying we should ignore the environment or the supervisor, but ultimately responsibility has to rest somewhere. It rests on the person. The material highlights 3 critical dimensions for succession: skills and knowledge, role perception, and self-efficacy. All 3 of these live inside the skin of the leader. We must nurture the high achievement drive of that specific human. If we dissolve leadership into some vague collective process, we lose accountability, we lose the driving force. We need the Sandhurst model. Select the best, train them well, and let them lead.
And I must push back one last time. Focusing solely on the individual ignores the harsh reality of the data. When 85% of training fails to translate to behavior, we have to stop blaming the learner and start looking at the environment. True development must focus on the collective level. We need to look closer at the employee-ship model. We need to focus on supervisor support, organizational alignment, and the social web. If you want behavior to change, you have to ensure the soil is fertile before you plant the seed. Otherwise, you're just throwing money into a void.
It seems we've arrived at a necessary duality. The text reveals that we probably can't choose just one.
I think that's right. You need the selection criteria. You do need capable people. You can't lead with incompetence, no matter how good the system is.
But you also need the systemic support that Baldwin and Ford describe, or that talent is just suffocated.
Right. Perhaps the answer is that the individual can only rise as high as the collective supports.
And the collective can only go as far as the individual envisions.
A fair place to leave it.
Indeed. We invite our listeners to look at their own organizations. Are you waiting for a hero to save you, or are you building a system where leadership can actually thrive?
Until next time.